Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'll probably go ahead and wait a little bit longer than 11:05 to get started, since I believe Martin just was wrapping.
All right. Hello and welcome. We should probably give everybody a couple minutes. The keynote went a bit long. We had questions and answers and everything. So while people are filtering in, I just want to say, Jeremy, thank you for stepping in earlier for Chris. I appreciate that, and for giving us this talk today. So
Not a problem.
I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Thanks, Ryan. And yeah, we'll hold off a few minutes just to let people trickle in. But actually, let's do something in the chat real quick. Let me find it. Always hides once I hit share my screen. I'm just going to put a question in the chat. Basically, let me know what integrations you're interested in and what integration means to you. I have some slides definitely put together and plenty of things to show and talk about, but I'm also perfectly happy to try and address other questions that people have. And then probably give it 1 or 2 more minutes and then we'll get going. Ooh, I hadn't even thought about repositories. So Efren, thanks for that. So that's not even something that I particularly touched on in a lot of detail in the presentation, but it's something, one of the things I'm going to do after the session is pull some of the resources that I have in my notes in the presentation, which we'll also upload, but I'll post those directly in the course to make them easily accessible to people as the moot draws to a close. But it's been a great couple of days, lots of fun sessions. And people can kind of keep dropping in questions if they come up with anything. But I'll go ahead and get started so that we can at least go through the material that I've planned, and we'll kind of see what other questions come up from people as we go. So welcome, everybody. I'm Jeremy Schweitzer. I'm the Senior Manager in Customer Solutions for North America and Latin America. And I've participated in the Mountain Moot in past years and lots of other moots over the years. It's always a lot of fun, and looking forward to maybe getting a chance to see people in in-person conferences coming up, maybe starting this fall. Today, I'm talking about extending Moodle through integrations, which is a really large topic. And so I kind of touched on this in a couple different ways. So here's my introduction, also just a little bit more of my background. I've been working in this space for a little over 15 years. I started as an instructional designer. So that is still occasionally the lens that I look at things through. but I've been doing implementations of LMSs for about 12 years. Did that for many years as a consultant and for generally government and higher ed for continuing ed kind of spaces before joining eThink and then OpenLMS over the last year. So what are we going to talk about? Why do integrations? Moodle has a lot out of the box, but why you might want to do more with that. And also kind of what and how to do that. And that's when we get into the alphabet soup. And then I have some Q&A kind of opportunity that I planned in. I think we'll still definitely have some time for that, despite kind of shifting a little bit to accommodate the keynote. So why integrate? This is a really big topic. And so I'm going to frame it in a few different ways. So one of the reasons that people like to integrate into other systems is to automate. So one of the things that you might be looking at is if you're a college is having an integration into your student information system. So maybe an integration into Banner or something else, whatever you happen to use. On the corporate side, it might be connecting into an HR system. It's because why you're wanting to pull information that you already have in those systems automatically into Moodle. So ideally, typically it's people wanting to automatically create their course shells and populate in their enrollment information without having someone to manage that themselves. You might be wanting to do an integration to pull in content. So that might be if you're working with a content aggregator, you might want to be able to pull the content that you're purchasing from them automatically into the system without needing to load every single piece manually in some way. Communication tools, we already had one of those examples pop up. Someone was talking about wanting to have options for integrate Google Meet. We also see a lot of integrations for those purposes around things like Big Blue Button, Zoom, which happens to be one of the examples that I focused on for today, and things like Teams. Any of those might be one of the reasons that you're doing an integration. One of the other really popular ones that people ask for help a lot with is the ability to export data. So wanting to make sure that you have a way of pushing information that's being generated in the system out to other systems. Streamlining operations, really just creating processes that allow that flow of information back and forth, or to really simplify things for students. So are they used to authenticating through a particular button that's maybe tied back to your Active Directory? Maybe one of the things that you're really looking at is just making that login experience kind of more familiar to them. So maybe setting up SSO so that it's simple for them to get in and out. And then another use case is e-commerce. So integrating in a solution around how people are going to purchase courses if maybe you're actually wanting to do that directly within your LMS. So now we get into the alphabet soup land of this. So this is just a cross section, a few of the options. Just these are the ones that I pulled some resources together to actually show and walk through today. So plugins, everyone's familiar with those. Martin talked about some options that are coming in the future for integrating those. XAPI, this is one that has been kind of a buzzword of various levels for years at conferences. I specifically put that in there because I also wanted to talk about how XAPI differs from the next one on the list, which is just an API. There is often confusion over the difference between those two, how they differ, how they are potentially the same, kind of how that all kind of frames in together. LTI, so Learning Tools Interoperability Standards, and how you can potentially use that in Moodle. and then flat file and database options. So this covers a lot of the common ways of doing integrations, but as we kind of saw pop up earlier, there are other things like connecting back to repositories to be able to push and pull information, like a Google Drive repository or OneDrive integration. One also that's pretty popular with some of our clients is setting up an SFTP that allows you to add content and have it automatically update and sync into multiple places throughout the system. You can also go broader. I actually had SCORM on here at one point because it is a way of doing integrations and pulling data back and forth between different systems, but I went ahead and pulled that one off. And when we talk about things like API, that is itself a really broad topic. Probably most commonly, people are talking about a REST API these days, but Moodle also supports SOAP and XML as options to be able to do an integration. And you'll see all of those sort of used in different places. One of the other things that I always recommend that people take time to think about and step back and consider is security, and especially the principle of least privilege when you are building integrations or considering adopting integrations. Does that integration, if it requires maybe a user, typically that's often done for API integrations where you're creating a user and tying it to a token to enable that API integration, does it really require full admin? Or could you potentially set that up with a role that has a lower level of access? And if you are setting up a web service, does that user that's tied to that web service really need to log into your system? Moodle has an option for an authentication method called web service that really limits their access just to using the web service side of things and prevents them from logging in on the front end. So just keeping in mind how you can make a robust integration without risking the security of your site. So now I'm going to dive into some of those options. So I always like to talk about plugins like their superpowers. They are the way that you can really jump up the capabilities of your site. And one of the things I always recommend is, especially if you have a particular integration with a commercial service that you're looking for, go and take a look at what options they offer. It's really not unusual to have multiple paths for doing those integrations. So Zoom is a great one to talk about here. And it ties also a little bit back to that security piece that I was talking about. And I am sort of picking on Zoom, but it's just because it's one that comes up a lot and we happen to be using it for the conference. So I thought it was a good one to kind of touch on. There are two main ways of integrating Zoom. You have an API solution that has a plugin that's available in the Moodle plugins database. And then you also have the LTI, which is typically what Zoom's own help desk will recommend to people. They're different. Take a look at the options, make your own decision about what makes sense. Do you feel like the plugin is well supported? Do you prefer LTI for one reason or another? Those are all decisions that every Moodle administrator needs to make for themselves. And also it may depend on your license, which one is available. Some licenses offer both, some only offer LTI or only API. But one of the reasons why I wanted to point out Zoom is they actually, for using their LTI integration, have an API component to that you can enable if you so choose. And their instructions used to clearly state that they recommended you having that user that you set up to be able to do that API component have full admin. So they've fixed that and no longer specifically recommends full admin for that role, because they literally only need to access, I think it's 2 functions to be able to provide the functionality that they've implemented, which is basically to put the events that you're scheduling onto your Moodle calendar. But it still doesn't tell you to limit that user to specific functions or really walk you through all of the advisable kind of ways of setting this up that is most secure. So I always recommend taking a look at the instructions that a vendor provides with a critical eye and say, does it really need this? And if you're not sure, you can always set it up once with less than what they're saying, see if it works, and add more permissions to a user or a token if you need to later. This is also typically where that realm of e-commerce comes in. Those are usually implemented as plugins within the system. And that can be everything from a full featured e-commerce catalog like OpenLMS Work has integrated into it, or something like IntelliCart or Course Merchant or Arlo. Those are full featured e-commerce solutions, or something a little more basic. And I typically recommend to people, if you're starting out with e-commerce, it's not a major part of your organization or learning plan already, start with something simple. Get your feet wet. Start with maybe the Stripe enrollment method, or something like the built-in PayPal integration. Find out how kind of robust your audience is before you invest in the configuration and potentially purchase of a more comprehensive e-commerce solution, unless you really know that's critical to your use case. Sticking with plugins for the moment, this happens to be a plugin that is called Event Trigger. This actually comes from the Catalyst group. They built this to allow you to create robust automations within the system. And for any of you that were in the OpenLMS Work kind of preview session that Dean did yesterday, the workflows kind of component that he briefly touched in is really an extension of this plugin designed to specifically tie into some of the multi-tenancy features. What this plugin allows, this particular example that you're seeing display on the screen, is a automation to really support a tool that you're all probably somewhat familiar with, Motivated, that allows anyone that's enrolled in a particular course on this site to automatically get added to a cohort that is tied into their particular, for this site's instance of Motivated, to be able to do get it set up and working the way that they wanted. What's really great about this plugin from an automation perspective is it allows you to take anything that is event-based in the system. So enrolling in a course, completing a course, anything that will trigger something in the events table, and react to that and take an action. So you'll see in this particular case that it's looking for the enrollment event. It's then got a filtering step that says only for this one particular course, and then take this particular action step, enroll, or add them to a cohort. What's really neat is you can extend this in a lot of different ways. So one that we have done for a client before was actually to set this up to, on the completion of any course, send basically a web service call out to an external system to record that completion. So that was something that wasn't particularly easy to do with the native API capabilities of Moodle, but by adding this plugin into the site, we were able to drive that data out of Moodle directly into the external system that particular site needed to connect with. What's cool is there's a couple different ways of doing similar types of things. The configurable reports block, which allows you to write SQL reports, has a relatively new option that actually allows you to push reports data out to external systems by web service. So it's another way that we've done some of data transfer out of Moodle into other systems. And then one of the other kind of alternatives for that, the custom SQL, often it actually shows up as the ad hoc reporting tool in the front end. That comes from Open University. And that particular reporting tool has the ability to save data to SFTP and or email reporting out. So lots of different paths for automating the flow of data out of your system or automating actions within Moodle itself. And then XAPI, in kind of contrast to API. XAPI is a specific standard originally developed as the Tin Can API out of Rustisi Software, which happens to be a sister company of ours. And they remain one of the kind of major players in this particular space. And it's specifically designed around taking specific statements, typically a noun, action, verb, adverb kind of structure of sending data as statements out of any system. It could be anything. Most commonly, we're talking about learning management systems, but really because it is an open standard, could be integrated into any system, and pushing that information into a learning record store, which also has basically a defined standard around it. In Moodle, what you're really looking at is integrating this most commonly through a log store. So because this one has fairly limited options, I just pulled in a screenshot for this, because typically what you're doing is you're just connecting to a particular learning record store and you're pushing out data. The one limit is it has to be data that is being written to the log. But that's what options are available for that are defined within the plugin. The plugin is typically well maintained, which is something that's really nice. And it has support for some other plugins. You're able to, if the plugin has a specific XAPI statement structure built into it for supporting the log store, you can enable or disable those types of, I believe they're called routines or routes, that for defining and transmitting information back to a learning record store. So to contrast that to a API, most of the time when we're talking about APIs in Moodle, we are talking about web services. So here's a spot where a little bit of the history of Moodle can sometimes come into play. The web services were initially defined to be able to support the mobile app. And so there is still a legacy of this occasionally working in ways that are unfamiliar to people who are not familiar with Moodle, but feel very comfortable with APIs, partly because of that legacy. So one of the kind of unique things occasionally is the most accurate API documentation will actually exist in your own site. And that's what I'm actually showing on the screen right now, is just taking a look at, in this particular case, I expanded out one of the API definitions around adding a user to a cohort. So all of this can potentially be automated and tied back into other systems. But we often, I'll have someone say, oh, great, where's the API documentation for Moodle? And the most accurate answer you can tell to someone is, well, in your site, because every plugin that you enable or add or remove to your site can change the APIs that are available and somewhat the behavior of those APIs. So there is some good documentation around working with the web services in the Moodle docs. But if you really want to look at specifically what's available for any given site, the built-in documentation is where you're going to want to turn to. My next topic that I was going to dive into is LTI, so Learning Tools Interoperability. So this is a particular standard. It's an IMS standard, and Moodle is actually certified. So basically what they've done is said, here's our implementation, and they have had it reviewed and independently certified. I believe, I haven't checked it, I guess, in like 2 months, but I believe that they are currently certified for as a provider of LTI 1.3 or as a consumer, and as a provider, I don't remember if they've actually certified for 1.3 yet. So LTI really is one of those kind of superpowers of Moodle, because unlike a lot of systems, it can be both what we call a consumer, so able to take an LTI from someone else and ingest it as an activity or as an entire course, depending on how you set it up. but it can also be a provider. And that's what I'm actually showing you right here on this screen. This is just a quick run through of how to set up a course as an LTI provider. There's a couple pieces to this. I'm really showing you this from the course perspective. And what you're seeing is that you're able to generate a registration URL and a secret and key that you would be able to provide to someone to be able to set up the LTI in their own site. So this can be used a couple different ways, both to push out a course to someone else's Moodle. We have definitely seen that happen where maybe a consortium of colleges are working together, and rather than have a course copy on every single person's site, especially if they're all using Moodle, sometimes they've said, okay, this person's going to host this copy of the site, and they're going to push it out as LTI to everyone else. And you have some control over how that gets configured, what roles get synced in, when the synchronization happens. And one of the other kind of cool things you can do is also limit the number of users that can access the course. So if you want it, at least via this particular method. So this can be a really powerful feature. You also have the ability to limit things down to just a particular activity within a course and just provide that activity out, or you can package the entire course. The other flip side of this, to show it, just to finish, setting this up initially has a few steps. None of them are hard. You just have to enable an authentication method. That's what then allows that external user to be able to, it effectively will create an account in your instance, but it'll be limited to access via LTI. And then also an enrollment method within the particular course that you're configuring this within. One of the neat things is you can set this up so that, for example, I've seen it set up before where someone had most of their content that they wanted to provide by LTI in one course, and then each individual activity was set up as its own LTI instance so that they could mix and match when building a course elsewhere or providing that information externally. And then you can also set up an LTI as a consumer. So this is a very popular method for doing integrations, especially with content companies. So most of the textbook publishers will have LTI options for being able to consume their content. And this is also a particularly popular way for training companies that produce training and content aggregators to be able to integrate in. So you'll typically receive from someone that you're going to consume their content the criteria you need to be able to fill out this particular form. It's as simple as just dropping it into the course. Depending on the LTI, you may also just be setting these up at the site level, and then it can just be added to every course that you need to access it from. So you have the option of being able to set this up at multiple different context layers, both the site and the course, so that it's accessible to everyone that it makes sense based on that particular LTI. So if set up at the site level, it can be added to any course. If set up at the course level, it's typically only accessible in that individual course. Let me check my time. Okay. And then moving into some of the other options for doing integrations. This one is one of my kind of favorites just because of its simplicity. And this is talking about flat file. The example I specifically pulled up in this case is actually the upload users capability. And I'm showing the front end version of this. What I really like about this method is it's simple to provide a template to someone else and say, as long as you use this template, and we've set some sane defaults on the site, you can just run this whenever you need it to create users or enroll them into courses or put them into cohorts or all kinds of actions that you would need to take in relation to a user, you can do from the upload users capability. Now, this is just one example of how you can do a flat file integration. So in this particular case, you just go to site administration users, upload users. There's an example CSV file that you're able to pull down, drop it in after you've configured it, and run through the process of creating those users. What's kind of fun is since 3.10, you've been able to take this process and actually run it from the command line. So this provides a whole new kind of universe for automating integrations. And a lot of people will say, well, the new way of doing all of this is APIs. Why aren't we just doing it all as API instead of using some of these methods that I'm talking about towards the end of the presentation, the flat file and external database integrations? Yep, lots of systems provide APIs, but not every system. And you don't always have a system of record that has all of the data that you need. So having a bulk way of doing this and bulk ways of automating this really provides greater flexibility for all kinds of organizations. And even if a system has an API, you may not have the team that is familiar or comfortable with using them. And they may already have other integrations that they've set up to be able to pull information out of whatever the source system is to a CSV. So if that's what someone is more comfortable with, the beauty of Moodle is you have the flexibility to meet people where they're at. So it just, that kind of greater flexibility that a system like this provides is just one of the benefits of an open source solution. And so other options related to flat file would be flat file enrollments, where you're really just scripting those typically from the back end, and Moodle will pick up that file and process it. And then you can also do a flat file process for creating course shells. That's the upload courses functionality. The flat file enrollments doesn't really provide an interface for doing that on the front end. That one's more of a command line SFTP only process. But both upload users and upload courses, at least since Moodle 3.10, can both be run from the front end and from an SFTP backend process. So you just gained a little more flexibility and provided greater coverage of the functionalities available on the platform. And then getting towards the end of the pieces that I had kind of pre-planned and pre-documented, external database integration options. So this one has been around in the system for a really long time. There's two primary external database integration options out of the box. Now, this is not talking about doing direct database updates. While that is possible, and some people happily do pulls of data directly out of the database and even pushes of data directly into the database, I typically don't recommend that unless you have a database team that is really talented at managing their database and is also very familiar with Moodle. I have, especially in my days as a consultant, on many occasions walked into an environment where they've said, well, we really like Moodle in a lot of ways, but it's just super buggy. And I start poking around and I ask, well, how are you creating users? How are you creating courses? Oh, we're just directly inserting them into the database. And a lot of the bugs that they are experiencing, I figure out, are because they're doing one of those processes in a way that is not actually quite matching what Moodle expects. And so they're creating some of their own issues. And there were other ways of accomplishing the same thing that were safer. So I typically recommend don't go to direct database updates first. Try something else is typically a safer option. So one of those safer options is the external database enrollment. That's what I'm actually showing here. This is the top level of those features. What's really nice is it allows you to directly connect to a database and do things like create your course shells, create your enrollments, and automate a lot of those processes. It does require that your mapping of your database matches kind of its expectations in many ways, but you do have a lot of power in this to be able to pull data directly out of a database. Now, you do have some security considerations for something like this. If your Moodle is not hosted in the exact same environment as the source database you're wanting to integrate with, you'll need to look at how you want to secure that, whether that's IP locking to particular disapproved IPs with an SSL protection on the connection, or something more robust like an IPsec VPN that provides a fully protected tunnel between those two environments. But most of the time, if you're talking about wanting to do something like this, you also typically have someone that has at least some familiarity of what kind of IT setup they would need to have this level of protection. If not, there's always ways of finding out and working with different both vendors or consultants to work through those kinds of challenges. You can also do a kind of related but slightly different process called external database authentication. It's always kind of funny to me because typically it's not really, you're not using that as your authentication method most of the time. My experience with people is they're using that as a user creation method. So what might be a use case for using both of these? If your system of record is, I'm going to keep going back to it because it's an example I work with quite often, Banner, you may actually be using external database authentication to create the users after you've created them in Banner, and then allowing them to authenticate maybe through a different method. So something like SAML SSO, but you're wanting to create their accounts via external database, and then managing all of their enrollments into their courses using the external database enrollment method. So the configuration for the two plugins is incredibly similar, but it's typically just setting up the database that you want to connect with, and then setting up the mappings for the particular fields that you are using. So now I wanted to give us some time for Q&A. So I'm happy to take questions. Let me take a look in the chat first. Okay, yeah. So like guesses, a lot of those are achieved with plugins. Typically like recommend those. Panopto has a great plugin. Library reserves kind of depends on who you're specifically working with, but a lot of them have some kind of integration option. And then Alan, custom APIs to integrate Moodle with user registration enrollments. Yes, it's a great use case for APIs. And typically with web services, if your external system can pull, you're able to easily get completion data out. But you occasionally do have some kind of system that you're wanting to integrate with that you're wanting it to be more real time. So rather than pulling, you're wanting to be pushing information, and then the tool trigger plugin is definitely one of the options I highly recommend looking at for anyone that's struggling with pushing data out. Partly because it's event-based, it allows for a really robust real-time data flow out to external systems. Happy to also take any other questions. Oh yeah, also custom development, always an option. That felt out of scope for this particular talk. People are also welcome to come off mute if they want to ask any questions. If not, one of the things that I will do, like I said, we'll upload a version of this presentation. So if you want to go back and watch some of those GIFs that I posted in there, just feel safer than trying to live demo occasionally. You'll be able to watch them. You can watch them loop a couple of times if you didn't quite catch everything that I talked about. And I'll also post resources for some of the documentation that I touched on.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Jeremy. Really appreciate it. A last reminder to everybody that you have only 1 hour left to spend your moot coin. So get out there and get it, because in an hour they're totally worthless. So all right, thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you in the next session and then the wrap up at noon. All right.